Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time late in the afternoon, late in the evening, or early evening for you. Really do appreciate it. First off, I'd like to introduce Dr. Alex Giberman. He's been working with AccuLens and with our products for quite some time now. So he is definitely versed in these products, especially SmartLens Pro. A little bit about AccuLens. We were founded in 1971, so we've been around quite a while. Our main product line has always been corneal GPs and custom scleral lenses. One thing that AccuLens prides itself on is excellence in design, especially when it comes to scleral lens designs. With a freeform lens design like SmartLens Pro, we've really pushed beyond what we used to think were limitations. Going forward, the product line itself is derived from extensive technology. These technologies, not only are they inherent in the design itself, but also in the equipment being used. Material is another big part of the product. We're using the hyper decay materials. They wet very well. They're very strong. They're specifically designed for scleral lens applications. Our manufacturing environment consists of a CAD system. The CAD system then sends the information to the machines, and we're using top of the line machines with the latest technology. These machines are DAC lathes. They're all operated on our MRP system, which is our CAD system. All machines have lasers, so etching on the lens is automatically done during the manufacturing process. The CAD system we utilize is a global CAD system. This is specifically developed for scleral lens designs, corneal GP designs. And so utilizing this in collaboration with the equipment itself creates one of the best lenses on the market. And I'll lead off to Dr. Giberman, and he can take the remainder of this presentation for you.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you everyone for joining. Good evening. And yeah, I'm excited to talk to you all about the AccuLens SmartLens Pro. I've had the pleasure of working with AccuLens for almost 10 years. Steve Cogger, who's also joining us on the panel here, was actually the person that flew out to my hometown almost 10 years ago and gave me the initial crash course training that got me started on this path. And so it's been really great working with and alongside AccuLens over the last 10 years and seeing all the innovations and all the new and exciting stuff moving forward. I think the one word that really describes the SmartLens Pro and AccuLens is versatility. This lens can pretty much do it all, and it's a great really a great all-in-one system. You know, whether you're someone that's just truly working off of a trial set of lenses, or if you've got every bell and whistle scan technology, HOA technology, AccuLens has really integrated itself nicely, and this lens pretty much works with all of those systems. And so that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today, which is all of the things that this lens can do. And if I could summarize that a little bit, it's capable of, if you think it, you can pretty much put it in this contact lens. Front toric, back toric, offset optics. You can center or decenter the multifocal accordingly. There's a large multifocal profile. It's a completely freeform lens by clock hour, which is really nice in certain circumstances. Microvolt, image guided. So pretty much any way that you slice it, this lens is capable of doing it. And it comes with a nice fitting guide. And to pretty much summarize this, I would say the one initial piece of information that's really helpful to have right out of the gate is the HVID. Because most of the trial fitting, the most important piece of information as far as selecting that initial lens is having a really good and accurate HVID. And then you're pretty much making modifications from there. So let's take a look at what is in these lenses. When you look at the trial set lens, the first thing that you'll notice is they are laser engraved. And I think this is a really cool system that Aculens put in place. It's called their on-point system. And there's basically two different sets of markings. We have the markings in the middle, which we'll talk about here shortly. And then there's the markings at the limbus. We call these the limbal curve indicators. And this is kind of a nice check to make sure that you've selected the right or the correct diameter of starting lens. And you're basically able to use these three hashes, and you're looking at where is the limbus in relation to those marks. So ideally, we have them labeled as A, B, and C here. Ideally, the limbus should land at the first mark, A, or between A and B. If the limbus is landing at C or outside of that outside hash mark, that is an indication that the lens that you've chosen is likely too small, or if you're using the largest diameter lens in the set, it's an indication that the lens diameter needs to go up, or that the limbal clearance at the very least also needs to go up. So again, it's a really easy to use, easy double check system. I know for me, like when I was first getting started, it was difficult sometimes to determine if limbal clearance was adequate enough. You get better at this, of course, as you go, and there's different ways of evaluating that. But at the end of the day, this is just another nice system to show you exactly where that limbal curve is, and it's a good double check of if it needs to be moved or not. So in addition to the limbal markings, you see these central markings with axis degree marks as well. And this is a really useful tool to evaluate centration when you're utilizing a multifocal fit. So as we know, if you've been fitting scleral lenses for a while, it is quite frequent that a scleral contact lens will not sit perfectly centered on the eye, but a lot of times will sit inferiorly, or it will inferior temporal. And this is a system that shows not just which direction, but also how much. And so Aculens on-point system has the ability to then recenter those multifocal optics so that the patient is able to best take advantage of the full add power. And the way that this works is when the lens is on the eye, you are counting the number of hash marks that are completely inside the pupil, and whichever meridian has the most hash marks, that is what gets recorded. So like in this example, we have 4 hashes inside the pupil at 45 degrees. So that is in comparison to 3 hashes maybe at 90 and at 0. So that is what you would record or send to the company to let them know, hey, my lens is decentering in this direction and this is the amount. So that when they are then sending you a final lens, that they know how much to move that multifocal and in which direction. That results in happier patients. So again, this is just a couple more photos and examples of how that works. Keeping in mind that, of course, a question that comes up sometimes is, well, what happens if you're adjusting the peripheral curves initially? Isn't that maybe going to affect the rotation? And certainly that's possible, although I think it's helpful that this trial set, the Smart Lens Pro trial set, is already designed as a toric periphery. So you're going to have a generally pretty good idea of how the lens is going to rotate already. And some of the adjustments that you'll be making, although it may affect it a little bit, the decentration typically is still going to be in the same direction and roughly about the same amount. So it's still pretty accurate. We found that to be, certainly an improved result for patients. We've actually gone back and in patients that were fit in multifocals years ago, before this was a thing, and refit them using this system and seen their vision improve. And then as far as the overall multifocal profile, so I would highlight maybe two different types of multifocals from AccuLens. One being a distance-centered multifocal, which is aspheric. And that in particular is probably best suited for early presbyopes, maybe 40 to 47. I think of that as having a max add power of about a plus 175. And then there's a center near multifocal, which um, that's the system that all of the decentered multifocal optics are going to be with that center near system. And that typically we're using for maybe 47 and up, or if the lens is significantly decentered. And what's nice about the multifocal is it can be used in conjunction with just about any other change. If you're adding a front toric alongside the multifocal, that can be accomplished. So if there's residual astigmatism, that's not a problem. If there's, a freeform back surface, a front toric front surface, and a decentered multifocal, a lot of bells and whistles going into that lens. AccuLens can handle it. And in addition to that, if there are some pupil size changes or um, anything else, really, the size of that near zone can also be adjusted. There's a standard size of 2.5 millimeters, but that can be made smaller or larger depending on the situation. So lots of adjustments that can be made in dealing with your advanced optics functionality there. I mentioned the aspheric multifocals, which again, we're either using that for early presbyopes, or I personally like to put the aspheric distance-centered multifocal in the dominant eye, and then I will often utilize the center near higher add multifocal in the non-dominant eye. And I found that just tends to give a better range of vision, maybe a little bit more intermediate, a little bit more near vision. So you've got a little bit of both, but it depends on the patient's needs, but it's nice to have those options. Additionally, AccuLens also offers an alternating zone multifocal if that's something that, if you're finding the first two options aren't quite working, that's actually a third option that you can utilize. So as we all know, multifocal is very patient dependent. It's really important to understand what are the goals of the patient. Are they a truck driver? Are they someone that's really only needing distance and a little bit of intermediate, and they're really not doing a whole lot up close? Or, are they a teacher or an accountant or somebody that's really going to be doing a ton of near work, and maybe they're not quite as dependent on perfectly, a perfect distance vision. So just like with soft lenses or any other types of lenses, we will kind of tweak our methods for what type of multifocal. And again, I think that's someplace that anybody that's familiar with AccuLens would agree that's a place that they really excel with their extensive multifocal profile. Usually, there's a way to figure it out and make sure that people are happy. Let's skip ahead here to some of the other freeform capabilities of this lens. So when I first started about 10 years ago, lenses had decent capabilities, but certainly not the capabilities that they have today. We were kind of thinking of the eyes, the scleral shape in terms of a steep meridian and a flat meridian. So we were able to kind of take advantage of toric peripheral curves. And then toric peripheral curves gave way to quadrant specifics, which was certainly nice, where we could kind of specify 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and we could make the edges a little bit different based on quadrants. And then we graduated from there to really do a full freeform by the clock hour. So that's not even necessarily something that we always need to be that specific. However, what Aculens does a really great job of, and it's something that not every company has the ability to do, is not every single bump or elevation, depression, pinguecula, there could be a lot of different things going on with the eye that are not necessarily only 90 degrees apart. And so being able to make a change, say at 12 o'clock, but also then make a change at 5 o'clock instead of having to go directly at 6 or directly at 3. I think that's really what makes this lens unique and special, is the ability to really specify where some of those toricity changes need to happen, and where we have the ability to put, say, a microvault. A pinguecula, of course, is not always going to happen exactly nasal or exactly temporal, so it's nice to be able to place those things very specifically on the eye. And furthermore, and I think we've got some slides on this later, but just while I'm thinking about it, with the microvault, you can actually specify not just the location, but also the depth and width of that microvault over top of the elevated areas. So that's a lot of bells and whistles going into that. And just like with the multifocals, it's really all of these changes are independent of one another. And our job, the most important thing is just paying attention to when that lens settles on the eye, where is that asterisk, where is that dot settling? It's going to rotate to the steepest meridian, the steepest part of the eye, and we need to make sure that we're documenting that rotation, so that when we make some of these other changes, that the lab knows exactly where to place these things. So this is what I mentioned, the asterisk is meant to be sitting at 6 o'clock, but depending on the contour of the eye, it will rotate accordingly. And it's just, again, important to notate that for really anything that we're doing, even if you're making the same peripheral changes all the way around, in case you decide to, go back later and make more, clock hour specific changes, or if the patient develops pinguecula or any other changes later on, if you decide to try and put some higher order aberration control in these lenses, noting the position of that rotation is super important, and especially important if you're using offset multifocal optics. So let's and this slide again, I know I mentioned this earlier, but this is an important thing to highlight, is all of these changes are relatively independent of one another. So there's really no limit to adjusting back surface toricity or freeform changes and still putting that into play with front toric optics. I would say, almost 90% of our patients have do not have spherical back surface in their lenses. So this is something that we're almost always going to have at least some toricity, and then depending on the situation, is how specific we get. But it just kind of gets ingrained in your brain that one of the first things that you're looking at is, where is the dot rotating to? Another question is, how long do you have to wait to see where the dot's going to settle? I think part of that depends on the patient. For an existing where they kind of already may have a little bit of an impression ring, that's going to settle pretty quickly. Generally speaking, if the lens is on the eye for a couple minutes, it's actually going to rotate to that steepest meridian pretty quickly. And if you're not sure, you can, of course, move the lens back to 6 o'clock with your finger, and then wait another 5 minutes and see if it rotates back to the same resting position. And usually you're going to find that, unless they have a very, very, very spherical eyeball, it's likely going to do that. So, I touched on this before, quadrant specific versus freeform versus toric versus spherical. I think for most patients, we can kind of get away with making, kind of still thinking of things in quadrants, but then still utilizing the capability of AccuLens to make localized changes by the clock hour. So just having that capability, do you always need it? No, but certainly it is nice to have it. There's no to my knowledge, there's no real upper limit of, if you have a really high prescription, high amount of cylinder, amount of toricity that can be put on the front surface of the lens. I personally have not run into any issues. I've got a number of high myopes, for example, that are touching minus 26 in power, with a decent amount of astigmatism as well, and that has not been an issue to input into the lens from an optical standpoint. When you're looking at amounts of back surface toricity, again, it would have to be pretty extreme to get outside of the limit of what AccuLens's lathe cutting is possible of doing. Potentially running into this issue if you happen to be in a clinic seeing patients with blebs or glaucoma tubes. Certainly we all know that that can account for a pretty localized extreme elevation. And even in those cases, many times AccuLens has been able to create a lens that has been able to handle it. And if it does happen to fall outside of that zone, they're very good at communicating if it's just something that's not going to be possible, that they're able to cut. So there's a lot of capabilities, again, even with some of your extreme toricity or localized elevation type changes. I would also highlight that one of the really nice things about the Smart Lens Pro is a lot of other companies out there, they have a lot of capabilities within their lens, but you cannot always change the diameter. And the fact that the trial set comes with a 15.5, a 16.0, and a 16.5, but you can really make that lens as small or as big as you need to, going in 0.1 millimeter steps. So maybe you've put a 16.0 on the eye, and you don't necessarily want to jump all the way to a 16.5. That's totally fine. You can go to a 16.2, and they're going to make those changes accordingly. Similarly, if you have a patient with a really large corneas, megalocornea, or just a large HPID, that is also not an issue, as you can go larger than 16.5. So a lot of flexibility in what they're able to handle. Going back to the microvault, which AccuLens calls their AccuVault, what's kind of neat about this as well is that it doesn't necessarily have it can be put anywhere in the lens. So, in the past, maybe we ran into issues where, if you had a pinguecula, great, you were vaulting just that outside peripheral curve. Well, what about if you have a pterygium or a Salzmann's nodule or something else that's more, internal, that's more inside of the cornea? That's okay. They can actually put those microvaults and elevations pretty much anywhere. And as I mentioned earlier, you can actually specify, if you have the instruments to do it, exactly how wide and how deep that you want those vaults to be created. And their general recommendation, you just don't want to put the vault all the way into the visual axis, for obvious reasons. So I think I have a couple case examples in here that just kind of highlight some of these things. So we'll just quickly go through that, and then I want to make sure we leave some time. I'm sure there are some questions that you may have, and we can talk about some of these things a little bit more in depth. This first case, pretty straightforward, just kind of highlighting a patient, 74 years old, with dry eye, but otherwise relatively healthy corneas, that was interested in multifocals, but was not having great success visually or from a dry standpoint with soft lenses. So we went with the scleral lens option. And certainly hard lens optics compared to soft lens optics are going to offer some nice benefits from multifocal standpoint, and then just having that fluid reservoir from a dry eye standpoint was helpful to a lot of these folks as well. A lot of other things you can do with dry eye, and that's maybe a separate conversation, but we encourage patients to some of our dry eye patients to put different things into the bowl of their contact lenses, assuming that those things are preservative free, serum tears, preservative free gel tears. So there's some wiggle room there. This patient in particular, again, relatively straightforward as far as her prescription. And dry eye, some things to highlight: the HVID in the right eye, 11.8. At that size, I think you could pretty much use the 15.5 or the 16.0. To kind of simplify things, if you think of a 12.0 HVID as kind of the dividing line, things less than corneas that are smaller than 12, I would use the 15.5 or the 16, and then for your 12.0 and up, I would use the 16.5. So in this case, we elected to use the 15.5 lens, and we evaluated the fit overall, which looked pretty good. Also worth noting, the right eye was the dominant eye. So again, for my older patients, I like to use the aspheric multifocal in the dominant eye, and I like to use the center near higher powered add lens in the non-dominant eye. So that's why we made those decisions on that one. When we looked at this lens, again, pretty straightforward, just looking at the edges. Were slightly flat, so we decided to tighten those one step. Also worth noting that in AccuLens speak, when you're adjusting edge for either flat or steepness, they go in 70 micron steps. So one step tighter would be 70 microns, one step steeper would be 70 microns, and you can also go in half steps. So you can actually go in 35 micron steps if need be. The left eye was larger. So at first, just for the sake of trying it, we put that 15.5 lens on the eye just to look at it, and pretty much expecting that it was going to be too small. Kind of a nice double check of using the limbal indicators to make sure you've got your correct HVID measurement. And indeed, it did show that the lens was too small. So we did end up increasing the diameter of the lens on the left eye to account for more limbal clearance. And we also noted that the lens had rotated about 40 degrees counterclockwise. Now, in this case, the lens was very well centered, so we elected to just kind of leave the multifocal as is. But certainly, had we taken advantage of decentering the optics there, that would be a very important thing to note. And as I mentioned earlier, we still want to note it just in case we're making some of these changes later on. So that's pretty much I think that pretty much summarizes this first case. If we move on to the second one, this was kind of our keratoconus patient, mild to moderate cone in the right eye, a little bit more significant keratoconus in the left eye. Also had a temporal pinguecula in that left eye of note. So some things that we want to account for there. The other thing to note, this patient's HVID was quite large, so 12.8 in the right eye, 13.1. And in this case, even the 16.5 diameter trial lens was not quite large enough. So this is where, some of the beauty of what's capable with AccuLens. Other companies, you're kind of dead in the water and you're hoping that you can just make enough limbal curve changes to account for that. Well, in this case, certainly makes life easier to just make the entire lens a little bit bigger in both cases to account for that larger corneal diameter. And then as we typically, we're evaluating the lens, the further away from the limbus you move, the more extreme some of those curvature changes occur. So in this scenario, we kind of made the assumption that we looked at the initial fit and said, well, maybe we could get away with a half step of change because the edges looked pretty good. They were a little bit on the flat side, but I just kind of made the assumption that as we made that lens a little bit larger, we may need to account for a little bit more curve um, at those areas. So we decided to go for a full step of steepening. And then we in our office are able to also utilize, we have the eye surface profiler, which is if you all are familiar with that technology, we're going to look at it in a moment, but that is super helpful for a lot of things. But one of the things it does really nicely is it measures elevation. So we're able to specify exactly how large in that location of that pinguecula to create a really well-centered AccuVault. So these were our final parameters. We ended up with um, on the right eye, a 17.1 diameter lens, and on the left eye, a 17.4 millimeter lens. And we ended up opting for the Optimum Extreme material, which has a little bit higher DK value compared to some of the base lens materials. And then, as I mentioned, we were able to account for that temporal pinguecula and locate that pretty specifically, and then account for it with the AccuVault, resulting in good vision. We don't have an edge then that's slicing directly through an elevated area of the eye. The patient's happy, less redness long term, and life is good. And then just for these last couple minutes, I want to take a look at what some of this other technology is capable of. As I mentioned in our office, we use the eaglet, the eye surface profiler, as far as getting corneal and scleral topographies and elevation, or profilometry as it's called. Um, but certainly, if you if in your office have Pentacam instead, which also has some of these capabilities, Acculens is also able to utilize the data from both the eye surface profiler and from Pentacam. We're just kind of looking at some of these images because this is what we have in our office. So the profilometer, again, again, to kind of summarize all of this technology, what I love about it, we try and get these scans on every single patient that comes in for scleral fitting, because even if we can't, if they have really tight lids and we can't get a perfect scan, it still gives us a great idea of what their eyeball looks like even before we put a lens on the eye. So even before I were to put a trial lens on the eye, if I already know kind of the elevations and the steep part of the eye and the flat part of the eye and where localized elevations might be, in my head, I already know um, what I'm expecting to see when I put that trial lens on the eye. I kind of already expect to know where it's going to rotate. And then furthermore, it's giving us a really accurate measure of the HVID, of the VVID, and then it even goes further. The software will actually interpret this data and will suggest the best possible trial lens in your set. So it really, it has a lot of great capabilities. Um, and then on the back end, once you have done your fit, you put a trial lens on the eye. You can then take that information, your over refraction data, input it right into the system. You click send, and it sends all of it directly to the lab. And depending on the quality of the photo and the data, um, Troy and the folks in Acculens are able to put that right into their CAD/CAM software and design a really good scleral lens. So in theory, you could really even forego putting a lens on the eye, because that software is going to tell you a lot about what's going to happen with that fit, and they're able to design a lens really with just that data. Um, However, in my experience, it's still very helpful to put a trial lens on the eye, because there's just certain things that a computer still can't tell us, and there's still I think the patient having the experience and seeing what they're going to see, and then having a really good, accurate over refraction to start with, it just kind of speeds up the process. So I certainly recommend still putting the best trial lens on the eye and making sure everything matches up with your scan data. But we certainly have found that utilizing these scans has reduced chair time. It certainly cuts down on the number of follow-up visits because we're pretty much nailing those really complex fits right out of the gate. Because, you know, it's one thing to look at an edge of a lens on the eye, right? And say, well, gosh, that looks flat. It looks really flat, right? But how much, right? How do we know the difference just eyeballing it of 200 microns versus 600 microns of edge lift? And this very much, again, takes that guesswork out of it. And it's super helpful when there's a really asymmetric or irregular sclera that's not necessarily, again, 90 or 180 degrees apart. It's helpful for the lab to see exactly where they're making these changes and to make sure that everything is lining up with what you're telling them from your own trial fitting. So I personally love using both. I still put trial lenses on every patient, but I also try and get these scans on every patient. So I have data, computerized data that translates really nicely into a successful trial fit on the patients. So I mentioned, you know, again, the data can get sent directly to the lab. It's really quick. It's easy to take the images. Um, you know, it's all done in direct gaze. It does require putting some fluorescein in the eye first, and there are some nuances to getting good images. But overall, it's pretty easy and quick to do it, which is nice because you don't want to be adding an inordinate amount of time to the visits when the patient's there. So it's nice that that's kind of a seamless and easy process, and it does all of that data interpretation pretty much with one click of a button. Again, Penacam has the same type of capabilities. You know, not quite as familiar with all the ins and outs of that software, but more or less it's able to map and do the exact same types of things from a scleral lens standpoint. And so this last example is basically just an advanced keratoconus patient where we were able to utilize the scan data. And you take a look at the picture. So if you're not familiar with these, the inner circle here that's kind of inside of this red zone, that's the corneal data. And then the outside data out here, outside of that red circle, is the scleral data. So these are basically two different maps overlaid on top of one another. The blues, so this is all these colors are elevation. So the blues are the lowest areas of the eye. The greens we kind of think of as sea level or the best fit sphere, and then reds are higher. So when we look at a picture like this, we can see at 12 and 9 o'clock, the eye is significantly steeper in those areas compared to the horizontal meridian. So this would be a pretty typical with the rule eye. But again, what you're able to do and what I'm not able to quite show just by using my mouse here, when you're using the software, you can essentially just hold the mouse right over an area and it will tell you how many microns is that depression. So again, it really helps to take the guesswork out of what you're looking, and it shows you the difference, right? There's all sorts of data on the side that will show you the difference in meridians, and there's all sorts of you can move things around and manipulate this in different ways. So it's a really powerful tool of taking a look and seeing what you're doing, because again, these scans go way out. You know, there's more data here even than we need. So it's helpful to be able to specify if you're using a 16.5 or a 16 millimeter contact lens, you want to know exactly what's happening at 16 millimeters. You may not really care what's happening at 17 or 18 millimeters because your lens isn't going to be touching those areas. So it's nice to be able to specify exactly what you're doing. There's been a lot lately made about, you know, centration and how toricity at the limbus affects that. Well, now you can measure it. You know, if you know that your limbus is at 13 millimeters, then you can set those parameters at 13 millimeters and measure the exact limbal toricity at that area, which again is great because with the freeform Smart Lens Pro design, their freeform doesn't just apply to the edges of the lens, but it also applies to pretty much all of the curves outside of the optic zone. So that freeform design starts inside the cornea, it starts inside the limbus. So if you have a very toric limbus, accounting for that toricity in the limbal curves will certainly improve your overall centration and optics of the lens. And that's something that's really helpful that we can measure using the instrument. And you can see that to a degree, right, with fluorescein staining patterns. But this is just a more exact way to measure that. And so the resulting fit, by utilizing this technology is super helpful. We can see in the left eye, this red area over on the nasal side represents a pinguecula. And when the lab sees this, again, they're able to look at that and measure exactly where that is, how deep it is, how high it is, and then create a vault over top of it that accounts for it. So I think that pretty much sums up all of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. Troy, Steve, anything else that you wanted me to touch on?
Dr. Alex, yes, there are multiple questions in the chat. One of the
I figured
questions
there
that
might
we,
be.
yeah, one of the questions that we always get is the asterisk mark. What happens when the asterisk mark rotates, and how do you fix that? Or what do you need to do in order to design the best lens once the asterisk mark is rotating?
So let's use this picture as an example. So if I put a lens on this patient right here, I would probably expect that that asterisk is going to rotate about 30 degrees to the temporal side or counterclockwise, just based off of the fact that the steepest meridian of the eye is tilted away from 6 o'clock more towards 5 o'clock. So, let's say I don't have this scan and I'm just put that trial lens on the eye, that asterisk has now moved 30 degrees or so counterclockwise. That's totally fine. It doesn't change a thing. All that you just go ahead and evaluate things the way that you would normally evaluate things. You're still noting any areas around the edges in terms of flat or steep, tightening or flattening, any of the other changes that you would record. I usually, so this is a question that we get, do you go ahead and do you do a spherocylindrical over-refraction right out of the gate? A lot of people in the past have said they don't like to do that because they like to see where the final lens will rotate. I think there's enough predictability when you have a trial lens set that's already a toric peripheral curve. The lens is going to rotate, although the edges still may need to be tweaked a little bit, and there may be some final rotation adjustments. For the most part, where that lens rotates on your trial set lens is going to be pretty accurate no matter what you're changing, unless it's really extreme. So I would go ahead and do a cylindrical over refraction and go ahead if there's a lot of residual astigmatism, I wouldn't necessarily have a problem including that right out of the gate. And the most important thing is simply that you're recording where that asterisk is so that the lab knows how to offset those optics on the front of the lens, so that it will be accounted for when the lens is ordered. And the same thing goes for if you're doing offset multifocal or if you're steepening a certain clock hour, you can still mention you just want to record, okay, I want to make the 2 o'clock meridian on the eye, one step steeper. That's fine. And then you're just saying at the end of it, just letting the lab know that the asterisk is at whatever clock hour, and that way they know where to put those edge changes or those optical changes or whatever changes are being made.
Perfect. So just to answer the question, we need to know where the asterisk mark is. if it's at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, or if it's rotated up until 12, just mark it on your order form and the lab will calculate the lens based on the asterisk rotation.
Yes, that's probably the most important thing outside of like picking a good starting trial lens, because otherwise the lab's not gonna, if you're saying, I would need to make all these edge changes and astigmatism changes, if you forgot to record the asterisks, they have no clue where to put those things in relation to your fit.
Awesome. Dr. Hivasati is asking us, how long does it take to adjust to wearing them, especially the multifocal design? What is the ideal wear time for the lens? Up to 8 hours a day?
I think it depends on the situation. So obviously, certain patients, as we know, like some patients can wear their lenses comfortable for 8 hours. Other patients wear their lenses for 16 hours. I don't like putting a number on it. I think I tell people to listen to their eyes and not push it. But the lenses are designed to be worn all day. Whatever all day means to that patient is different for everybody. I think if you're an extreme dry eye patient, or you've got you know, a graft, a corneal transplant, I try to tell those patients, we definitely want to start on the lower end of that, not encouraging them to wear the lens for 16 hours, because we want to let that eyeball breathe a little bit. Um, but I think there are plenty of patients that can wear their lenses all day, whether that means 12, 13, 14 hours, and they're fine with that. Multifocal patients, if they're new to multifocals, I think the more they wear the lens, the better, because of neuroadaptation, right? They're going to, every day, in theory, it should get better and better, and their brain should get better adapted to those optics. So we encourage those patients to, wear their lenses quite a bit, and just so that they can get used to what they're seeing. And then, understanding too that we always let those patients know, hey, we'll follow up, and if we need to tweak things, if we a lot of times it's a matter of not necessarily adjusting the multifocal, but adjusting maybe a quarter or a half step of added plus if they want better, or more significant reading, and we would maybe do that in just a non-dominant eye. But yeah, I don't know that, again, there's a specific number of hours of wear time. And then for multifocal patients, we try and encourage them to wear the lenses as much as possible over that first week, just because we think that it should, in theory, get better and better. There was a study that was done with higher order aberration control, and I couldn't say that the same exact thing applies to multifocals, but I would jump to make this assumption. The study looked at HOA control on day 1 versus day 30, and they found that pretty much everybody improved, almost in some cases, a full line of vision, as their brain adapted to that over the course of a month. And I would expect the same thing to kind of happen with multifocals.
Awesome. Dr. Amansh Salah from Iraq is asking us, on the HVID of the patient, do we add 3.5 mm to the actual lens, or do we always base on the LCI mark ABC?
Again, I would say, as a general rule, like for me, I kind of use 12 as my benchmark, and like my trial set of lenses is set up a little bit differently. I have one that has 2 diameters instead of 3 in it, although I have a separate set that has a smaller lens diameter. But in the case of having a 15.5, a 16, and a 16.5, I would say that 12.0 is kind of the benchmark. And then you're kind of, if you're maybe just a little bit below 12.0, I would start with the 16. If you're much above it, I would go with the 16.5. And then if you're maybe 11.7 or less, I would go with the 15.5. But yeah, I mean, if you want to use 3.5 or 4 millimeters as kind of you're adding that to the HVID, that's totally fair. Just knowing that you may end up sitting somewhere right in between those trials. And if you sit right in between, it's probably going to be okay either way, depending on, you may go one way or the other. Say if there's something on the eyeball that you're trying to avoid, And keeping in mind, you can avoid certain bumps like a pinguecula by going smaller, or sometimes going significantly bigger, right? You can sometimes get away with not using a vault if you're extending that landing zone and kind of flattening and pressing that pinguecula down, or just jumping over it completely. So there's no you know, perfect rule that goes there. I think it's just, yeah, you can use 3.5 or 4 millimeters as your general guiding principle, but either that or you just kind of use 12.0 and then go from there.
Awesome. Dr. Mohammed from Saudi Arabia is asking us, how do you address challenges like conjunctival prolapse or pingueculas when designing the limbus on the freeform lenses?
So as far as prolapse goes, I think that it depends. Like, depending on how much there is, you have a couple options. Using maybe a more oblate uh, design lens, letting the lab know, hey, I've got, some prolapse, and kind of having a more oblate design lens to kind of flatten that central base curve and kind of minimize, the steepness of the landing zone, or extending that landing zone out a little bit further in the periphery tends to minimize that. So sometimes playing with the overall lens shape, and that's where that smart curve comes into play. You can minimize or mitigate some of that doing that. In certain circumstances, maybe fenestrating a lens can be helpful. AccuLens has the capabilities to do that as well. So you can kind of choose your spots. If you have prolapse in just certain areas, you can always try doing that. But usually we don't necessarily have to go that route. We've kind of gone more of starting with a larger, flatter lens, or and that seems to help minimize some of the prolapse issues. If it's, again, kind of a localized area, you also have the option, like, let's say there's only inferior prolapse. You could truncate the lens, where you're essentially chopping off the lens bottom, and letting it just kind of have a flat region and in a certain part of the lens that just then avoids that area altogether. So in certain circumstances, we've had success doing that as well. So I think a couple different options depending on the circumstance.
Great. Dr. Nesar Damati from Jordan. He's been fitting SmartLens Pro for quite a while now. He's asking, how much minimum center thickness can you make with SmartLens Pro with a -6 diopter, as the lens material should be required for PKP management?
That might be a good question for Troy. Troy and Steve, what is the minimum thickness that the lab is capable of?
Go ahead, Steve. No, okay, I'll take it. No problem. The minimum center thickness typically that we try to send a lens out is 200 microns. Now, keep in mind, if this information is relayed to us, the patient needs more oxygen transport through the lens, and the lens needs to be thinner. We don't focus just on center thickness. We do focus reducing it by at least 30 to 40% throughout the whole lens itself. And that helps us achieve a better decay ratio to lens thickness.
I think so. That's a great point. Kind of reducing the thickness throughout the lens, and then I've been a part of lectures. John Gellies, for example, saying that for some of his post-transplant patients, he'll actually shoot for a fluid reservoir level of about 75 to 100 microns, which typically, that would be pushing it a little bit. But just, it's not, of course, just the thickness of the lens that's accounting for oxygen depletion, but it's that fluid reservoir as well. So if you can try and cut down as much as, we do the same thing. We cut our, if we generally would shoot for initial central clearance of 200 to 250 microns, on some of those graft patients, I kind of shoot for 150. as a starting point, knowing that throughout the day, it might be only 50 to 75 microns by the end of the day, but that is okay. And a lot of times for those patients, it does really extend their ability to wear the lens without causing some unwanted edema. And the lens materials themselves, right? So then, for those patients going with the 200 DK lens material with the Optimum Infinite is nice to have that as well.
One other note too, in regards to tear meniscus and what's under the lens is for these type of patients, it's also important for them to remove the lens 2 or 3 times a day in order to, refill the bowl with proper solution, clean solution, because as over time it tends to build up debris, and that reduces the amount of oxygen going into the eye.
So this is the beauty about freeform, guys. I mean, we can actually reduce the thickness of the lens overall. We also can provide them with higher DK materials, just like Troy was saying at the beginning of the presentation. Please remember you have different materials available, even Acuity 200 DK. And just let us know if the patient is a post-transplant patient so that we can adjust the final lens to your patient needs. Dr. Hussein, Amir Hussein from the United Arab Emirates is asking us, should we always instruct the patient to wear the lens in the form of the asterisk located at 6 o'clock?
Yeah, so in general, we do instruct our patients to look for that and to try and put it as close to that 6 o'clock as possible. But I also, for in certain circumstances, I will tell patients don't obsess over it because to a degree, it's going to rotate to where it's going to rotate. So if the lens is rotating, it doesn't matter how many times they try and push it back to 6 o'clock, it's still going to rotate. And that's just, if that's unwanted rotation, that's just important for the practitioner to notate so that they can make those adjustments and let the lab know to make any revisions. But certainly, if they can get it closer to 6 o'clock when they put it in, that just makes it so that it will settle faster. It'll get to the point that it needs to get to quicker.
Can I just
Awesome.
chime in for 1 second on that asterisk too, because I think it does get a little confusing when you're comparing the asterisk on your diagnostic lens versus the production lens that you.
Oh yeah, good point. Yep.
So on the diagnostic lens, the asterisk is always along that steep meridian. So when you're evaluating that lens, you want to put it on close to the lower lid, assuming that it will align at 6. But as you can see, even on this scan that's up on the screen right now, as Dr. Gibman pointed out, that asterisk, if you put it on the eye at 6 o'clock, it's most likely going to rotate closer to 5 o'clock, just kind of looking at what we've got there. When you relay that to the lab that your diagnostic asterisk was sitting 30 degrees off axis or 5 o'clock, however we're going to phrase it, when we design that lens now based on all your input and feedback, the lens is still going to sit like that, but we've now programmed the asterisk to sit where we have predicted 6 o'clock will be. So on your production lens, the asterisk is designed to sit at 6 o'clock. We don't always get it 100% right. So if it's off on that production lens by, whatever it is, 10, 20 degrees, definitely you need to continue to let us know. So on the production lens, it should be aimed at 6 o'clock. On the diagnostic lenses, put it on the eye at 6 o'clock and then take note of where it rotates to.
Yeah, so that's a perfect explanation. 100%. So if you're telling the lab that the dot rotates to 5 o'clock, your final lens should actually still be at 6 o'clock because that's kind of then how you can check to make sure that those changes, that everything ended up where you expected them to. So yeah, I guess to answer the first question, the patient really should be trying to get it close to 6 o'clock, but if they put the lens in at 8 o'clock, the expectation is that it will eventually settle and rotate back to 6 o'clock.
Yeah, so it's very important for us to know where the asterisk is. So just relate that to us so that we can input that into manufacturing. Dr. Othman is asking us if you can give any training for doctors that are not in the United States. Of course, we're always doing trainings every single week. I'm going to write down my email address. We can do roundtables. We can do one-on-one training. We can discuss cases. We have a team of 5 consultants that are always available for you and to give you the proper training and just answer any question you might have, Mr. Altman. There is my email address in the chat. We have another question from Dr. Mohammed. In patients with severe nasal versus temporal scleral asymmetry, example, 300 microns elevation difference on OCT, how do you adjust the quadrant-specific optic zones without inducing the lens rotation or edge standoff? Great question.
So, you know, in theory, it doesn't, the final result, right? It doesn't matter. Now you mentioned, like, let's say that the rest of the eye is spherical and you just have, in this example, it's just the nasal side that's really elevated, you know, and you're saying, well, I've got a toric, you know, trial lens, but I know that the lens is basically just sitting on that really high point, and I'm not confident exactly where everything's rotating. You know, maybe that's an example of where you don't necessarily want to put a front toric on the lens right out of the gate, because you want to obviously account for that elevated area first. And then, you know, if you end up getting a lens that then does have a nice, where you've accounted for that elevation, then you can start kind of going back and saying, okay, now I'm pretty confident this is where the lens is going to settle. And then you kind of go from there. So maybe that's a potentially a 2-step process, unless, you know, if you have the ability, if you have that imaging technology and you know exactly where it is, you're going to be more specific and likely have a better fit right out of the gate. But you kind of handle that the same way. I mean, you're still recording where the asterisk is. You're letting the lab know. I mean, the more information you let the lab know, the better. If they know that, hey, the rest of the eye looks about the same, but the lens is basically rocking on one really high area, that's important for them to know so that they can try and account for that out of the gate the best that they possibly can.
Great. And last question, do you have options for fenestrating these lenses?
Yeah, so you can make fenestrations. I think that you know, a lot of times if we're gonna do that, we're including 3 fenestrations. You can put them wherever you want. So, you know, that's definitely something that they can do.
Great. So for doctors that have eaglet, just remember, make sure to go into Eaglet Direct Connect, choose Oculens, and then choose the lens design Smart Lens Pro. For people that have Pentacam CSP, let us know, and we can create a Dropbox link so that you can send us all the images and we can design those lenses for you. Please let us know if you have any questions. It's always important to let us know if the patient is a post-transplant patient, or what do you want to achieve, if you want to have thinner lenses, or what is the best ideal fit for you and your patient. Record every single fit, send us pictures, videos, and of course, use the order form that we have created for you. And if you need additional training, please let us know and we can create roundtables or one-on-one meetings with you. You have our email address. Thank you so much for participating in this great conference. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Troy, for joining this meeting. And I hope everyone has a great night. Ramadan Kareem to everyone. And I hope to see you in the next conference.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Have a good night. Thank you so much.
Bye.